And hello, everybody. We are back doing our final grouping of presidents. We're going to be looking at the presidencies of President George W. Bush and President Barack Obama. And one thing I am going to do after some thought, I said, "Oh, I'm putting President Bush the first and President Clinton. I'm going to keep them together." And I'm going to put them both as C, although I would have them toward the high end of C. I just looked at the other presidents in this list and I thought they were far more consequential and than these two presidents. Although Bush gets close to that B because of the fall of the Soviet Union and the ending of the Cold War. But there are some negatives on his and handling Iraq. Hard to say. I'm wishy-washy. I'm gonna put him back up here. Clinton, he has some legislation. It's mixed. I don't. He's a good president. He's solid. I think you look back at his presidency, and comparatively speaking, it's good times. But that's also because I think honestly the past two presidents have not been very strong, and the country has unraveled under their time in office a little bit further. I'm comfortable with what I have here. I could put Clinton as a C plus B minus, but I'm going to leave him in C for now. I think I like that list. He'd be a high C. I don't think he'd put it this way. I have Jackson on there. I think Jackson's a much more consequential president and did a lot more. And it reflected the time era very well. And I don't want to judge President Jackson's actions based on today's standards. Unfortunately, there was a lot of angst toward Native American. I think his biggest thing is, he does kind of defy the Supreme Court, and it's all tied to the Indian Removal Acts. There was a lot of resentment toward Native Americans. That's just a historical fact because of their involvement in the American Revolution and the War of 1812. This really had created a sentiment, especially on the frontier, of high level of anxiety and anger. And I think that plays a part in that legislation. I think it was horrible legislation. I'll say that. It's unjust, but by the standards of that time, it's under it, within the context, I get it. I'm not saying I support it. I'm happy. I'm okay with that decision. All right, let's go ahead and look at President George W. Bush. George W. Bush faces one of the greatest tragedies in the history of the United States, the September 11th attacks. Makes him so explicitly damaging to the United States as they're seen on live TV. They're covered all the time. Past tragedies. We can go even with the bombing of Pearl Harbor. It wasn't seen simultaneously by the entire country and the entire world. It is an absolute disaster. I don't buy into that. It's just formed in to the argument that these people hate us because we love freedom. I don't believe that at all. I think it's a much more complex issue, the problems that we have in the Middle East, than simply they hate us because we love freedom. That's an easy answer to a difficult question. The Americans had policies that have hurt people in the Middle East. We've chosen sides and switched sides. I don't want to go into a long policy, but I think that it's a simplistic answer. And yes, they dislike us, but on a balance sheet, they have reasons why. Everyone has reasons, and you have to understand that those reasons are valid. That's why you have conflicts. In President Bush's defense, I think his job during the beginning days of 9/11 were amazing. He truly gave America hope at a time, and he enjoyed again the goodwill of the American people in time of a real crisis, that the American people did rally behind their country and behind his leadership, and he earned the high marks during the time. And understandably, he leads attacks on Afghanistan, and then we go to nation building, which never has worked in our history. We've tried to nation build in in the last 50 years, numerous times. It has not worked very well. It's different than the nation building that we do under the Marshall Plan, which is not military occupation. Military occupation, along with nation building, is a recipe for disaster. It hasn't worked very often in history. And it's a path that the United States will follow in the Middle East after 9/11. And obviously there are negative aspects again, and the negative aspects are not just, it's obviously the casualties that are suffered, but also the cost and the damage to prestige. And understanding the idea, it's borderline imperialism that was going on. There's an aspect that nation states that has existed really since the mid 17th century with the signing of the Treaty of Westphalia, that nation states are sovereign and they do have the construct of self-determination, and that war is not the way to solve it. That's been kind of a prior to 1650, 1648, with the Peace of Westphalia that ends the 30 Years' War, which is a series of treaties, and they all have a construct of the idea of statehood and sovereignty and self-determination for a nation state. And I understand that sometimes nation states do horrible things, and governments do have to look at and see, is the offense so egregious that other states have to act? That's a good question. That's a good point. But the nation building attempts were very much imperialistic. The Iraq War and the nature of Afghanistan and the foreign policy decisions of nation builder are an absolute disaster to the United States. The authorization of military force, it totally changes the construct. This is an extension of the War Powers Act, which is, again, because of American long-term involvement in Korea and Vietnam, which are different than the Afghanistan and the Iraq, not the engagement so much, but the occupation afterwards. And the not following the UN's ruling on the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, it turns out that it seems that it was right. And I understand that sometimes America wants to do what it wants to do, and we're a superpower. But in this case, again, they probably were not well thought out. And it's not saying that you couldn't have done things militarily, using the military to pay back Afghanistan, if warranted, to pay back Iraq. President Bush the first, and this is another reason why I bumped him back up to a B, he does not get involved in a long-term solution by putting American soldiers as an occupying force, which his son does, and it's a disaster. Some other things that he has, it's the Medicare supplement on prescriptions is his legislation. From my point of view, and I try to be careful with having my own bias, I think it's very good legislation. When you look at some of the entitlements, especially those to senior citizens who have been citizens their whole life and done right by America, they've worked hard, they've paid their taxes, they put into systems and programs that were designed to be that safety net for them. If you take away prescription drug care for senior citizens, you would have and keep Social Security intact, you'd approximately have about 2/5 of American senior citizens living in poverty. If you take away Social Security or make substantive cuts in it, 2/3 of the American population would who are entitled to those who are participating in those entitlements would be living below the poverty line. And this is something that Americans have to answer. We live longer, and we do have to, you could make arguments that you have to address Social Security and the entitlements, the way they're handled. But you're looking at 2/3 of the nation, of this subgroup of the nation, who are not living in poverty due to these programs. So I think it was a very good program. NCLB, it hasn't worked. Its education has been following a bouncing ball since 1984, when the Nation at Risk report came out, and it's always the same thing. There are problems in the public schools. what a lot of people don't realize is that most of what happens in the public schools is not necessarily a result of the public schools. It's what happens the time that they're not in the public schools, when they're at home. And you can look at the socioeconomic situations of students, and you can really determine and very accurately project where they'll be out when they are of an age to graduate high school. There's also constitutional issues with such a deep involvement in what has traditionally been state policy. Education is a reflection of a society, and what is being seen in the mirror is reflecting American society over the last 40 years. Some things are good, some things are not so great. The recession hits in 08. The bailouts, no. Were they absolutely necessary? Probably. But what happened after the bailouts, and, with looking at the causes of what caused this tremendous catastrophe in the banking industry, and then goes to all elements of society, and what happens, there is room for criticism on that and how that was dealt with too, and protections that might be afforded that doesn't happen again. But Iraq and Afghanistan are his legacy. And I remember when he ran, he said he wanted to be a combination of Bobby Kennedy and Ronald Reagan, which are very different people. But one thing they both have in common is they're dealers in hope. And President Bush never comes across in that, and his policies are actually very bad, and they crush hope. Again, with his war powers policies. I'm not going to give him an F because of his handling initially after 9/11, but he is not a strong president. He's one of the weaker presidents that we had. So let's go to President Barack Obama, who runs on hope and change. And he says, I'm all about hope and change. And I think he does give large segments of the population, especially minorities, and that's a significant achievement, hope. He doesn't do so much for the rest of the country. His policies he doesn't work well across the aisle, especially in healthcare. And, there are strengths and weaknesses to the Affordable Care Act. And I know many people hate it. Some people love it. Well, few people love it because there are a lot of weaknesses to it. And part of the problem with this, no Republicans support it. Now, they did this on an ideological level and also an unwillingness to work with him, but also President Obama didn't reach across the aisles. And, you would never have expected that a Reagan would be able to work across the aisle with Tip O'Neill, that President Clinton would be able to reach across the aisle and work with Representative Gingrich, because they come from such ideologically different places. It was not, and he did have a strong mandate. He won decisively over former Senator McCain in the election, but he doesn't create an environment where he can work well with the opposition, with, his colleagues who are on a different point. It may be still too early to judge on him, although it's 15 years after his first term. So the Affordable Care Act, it meant well, and it has some really good changes that are beneficial. I try not to bring too much of my bias on this, but I just try to look, it's impossible, to have all. I'm a big believer in utility. What makes the most sense and does the best for the largest members of the group is usually the best way to go forward with public policy. And an example is pre-existing conditions, and having them covered by insurance is big. The problem with the implementation of the Affordable Care Act is that the design of it was that it was going to be that three groups were going to be taking a hit. Is the medical agencies, the medicine itself, and that's not just the doctors, it's also pharmaceutical companies. They're going to have to take a hit in some ways. Consumers were going to have to pay for this, for guaranteed health care, and the insurance companies would be taking a hit. Unfortunately, that has not been applied, and it's been applied mostly to consumers taking a big hit, with insurance companies taking a relative hit, but the medical industry, especially other, practitioners, how prices are set, people who provide medical care, they have not borne their share of the burden. And that's one of the reasons why there have been a lot of problems with it. The costs of it and the implementation of it. So I think it means well. I think there's some real positive changes that have come from it, but it's not been effective because the idea is everyone was supposed to be sharing in this burden, and that sharing has not happened to this extent. There might have been other ways to go about the plan, and unfortunately, different voices, especially if they were Republican or even if they were basically bipartisan, they were not heard. And I understand the legislation is complicated. Sometimes they have to be, but um, Affordable Care Act is there are net gains to it. It could be better policy and better implemented. And again, it does serve that utilitarian policy. So on a lot of things, especially in foreign policy, he basically is a continuation of President Bush's policies and continues the occupation and the rebuilding. And again, this is not something that necessarily the military is really designed for, in my opinion, and a lot of others' opinions. And it's a disaster. It just doesn't work well. You can't just shine something up if it's bad, it's bad. And his a big kudos on the death of bin Laden. Obviously, that was good. It had to happen. This person is the person who masterminded this horrible attack on our nation, and there had to be a recompense for that. The scales had to be even, but the way it went about was probably not the best means to an end. So getting up bin Laden is good. He does ratchet up the budget, and with a lot of a lot of bailouts. And again, you can look at them from either way. I mean, there is an aspect in capitalism that industries are responsible for their actions. And so you have, with bailouts and the extent of the bailouts and the number of bailouts that are done, it's really kind of a crony capitalism. Now you have to weigh that with the extent of what would the long-term effects have been to the economy. But there has to be some recompense. There has to be some way that these people that take risks, if an individual takes a risk and they lose their job and they lose their house, there's no bailout for them. And I think that's something to look at, the crony capitalism that is rampant in society, and he continues it. He labels himself a dealer of hope, but I'm not sure how effective he is in actually fulfilling that construct of being a dealer in hope. I don't think he's an awful president. I would never say that. I would say he is I think he, although he follows a lot of President Bush's policy, he didn't get us in the mess, and Bush did. And that's on him. And he's going to be a C. Now, the last two presidents, I'm putting them in the not rated column. I'll just make one comment. I am unimpressed with either of them for varying reasons. Wouldn't give them anything above a C, either of them. But that's me. So we have my list, and now it's time to let's see who's in this top tier. Well, it's pretty obvious. I base this on a couple things. All these presidents are very strong presidents. Some of them possibly, I could see bringing down Jefferson possibly to a B, although he has so many net positives. I could see bringing down Eisenhower, but then it might surprise Truman, maybe Kennedy because of lack of time and because of some of because of his tax laws that have really caused an increase in the poverty gap, you could say. But they also each have so many strong things that they did. So I'm going to say is based on their situation and on the existential threats they faced, in which situation do you have someone who's a great president? Well, Washington is one. He's the first. The nation is very vulnerable. He is head and shoulders above the rest. He sets the precedents for the presidency. And he's dealing with us as a new nation, and his policies of non-engagement with Europeans and not getting entangled and resisting that is something that's very laudable. The way that he models the peaceful succession of power, his humility in office, and his decision-making process they give the nation such a firm foundation and strides down a great step. The next one, and it's not in the ranking, this is Lincoln. He faces the gravest existential threat of the nation, which is basically a civil war. The nation, these United States, weren't these United States for 4 years. And he leads the nation, albeit with mistakes. Some of his decisions as commander in chief, and these are not perfect people, but the threat that he faced and how he handled it put him head and shoulders above the A, along with Washington. The third one is going to be my surprise pick. I think the gravest threat that America faced since the Civil War was nuclear war, and things going really bad with the Soviets. And so that's going to tone it. Now, Jefferson had threats. He's a great president, but he stays A. Roosevelt also is a great president. He doesn't have a crisis situation that is going to be an end to the nation. Now, I would argue that Roosevelt doesn't have a crisis situation that's an existential threat to the United States. Germany could not have reached the United States. Japan, it was even the Japanese planners who planned Pearl Harbor, they felt that their chance, even if successful, of defeating the United States was about 1 in 15, 1 in 10. Was not really, they could never have gotten past the West Coast, even with a small presence. It just wouldn't have happened. Truman does face the nuclear threat, and he handles it really well. But he has some other issues that kind of keep him down. Kennedy and Reagan both do a good job with the crisis, Cuban Missile Crisis, absolute existential threat to the United States, and Kennedy gets through it with flying colors. But again, it's his inexperience that puts America in a situation that Khrushchev was able to maneuver around him and create the crisis. Reagan, you have to look at, again, what's happened to the economy since then. And the division between rich and poor is greater than it's ever been. And the tax plan, the basic structure that he did, following the model of Kennedy in 1960, and this is the last time that we had a balance. We had basically a distribution of wealth that was close to where the middle class was actually really looked like a middle class. And it's changed because of many factors, and tax policy is one of them. But the Great Depression, America would have gotten out of it eventually. And FDR's policy, if you look at the analysis of economic factors, his policy does not get the country out of the Great Depression. And World War II, he is a great motivator. This is a great president. But as far as consequence to the history of the United States at a key moment, I don't see World War II as being that the country is going to be dissolved. So the one I'm going to put in this group is Eisenhower, because I think Eisenhower, Russians had developed nuclear weapons by this time. They were being assertive, and his restraint and his toughness, the mixture of toughness, and that's not saying he's a perfect president by any means at all. His handling of the Cold War and to the transition point where America was in the lead and now Russia is in the game. Truman always had the advantage that America had the bomb and the Russians didn't. They didn't have what we had. Eisenhower, for the entire time of his administration, they are even with us. And yet he manages to contain communism as an ideological and economic force. But he also shows real restraint in situations that could have tipped it really badly, notably the Suez Crisis and in Hungary, the invasion of Hungary by Soviets in that satellite country. And again, the basis of the economy, the kind of era, almost to the era of good feelings that he does again. And I think his warning about the danger of the nexus between industrialism and military hardware companies and then decisions made by the Pentagon, I think is a stark warning that has gone largely unheeded and is not a positive thing. So we have our top three, and I understand that, you could pick any one of these three, any one of these 6 others remaining. I mean, but I think as far as the ones who were key in their time frame, I'm going with these 3. But number 1, I think it has to be between Washington and Lincoln. And this is a hard one. Lincoln is just so transformational. And we are left with a what if. he served his second term. Washington is amazing. He sets the precedent, and that, I think, his idea of successful, peaceful, peaceful succession, and is so vital, and hopefully that spirit comes back. I'm going to mull on this one. I want to make a decision. I've thought about it, and I've had it as Washington for so long, but Lincoln is really, as I've restudied them, he's gone up. I don't think you can go wrong with either one of them. So what I'm going to do is I am going to, tough call. I wish I could have a poll. I have to say Lincoln is probably the greatest of all time. And I've never said that before, but I think looking at all the presidents and the whole, I've always had Washington as best, and I might change my mind, but that's okay. But for this, right now, I think we need an Abraham Lincoln, someone who is wise, could take a stand, and had a progressive look toward the future. I'm not talking about uber left of center politics, or economic things, but he was looking at what does the nation need to do to progress and move forward to become that more perfect union. And so I'm going to say Lincoln is the greatest president of all time. So I hope that you enjoyed this travel through history with me. And I think we have a nice distribution, which is always good. And I think that just normally happens, that we have, these are the best and these are the worst. And these ones, too soon to say, but they're not going to probably rise above a D, either of them. They're for different reasons, they're not effective. Their net gain on America, they've not moved America forward in many ways. I think we have a good list here, though. And the thing is amazing how many of these are really solid presidents, and some C's should go up, and not really many go down. We've been pretty fortunate with our leadership, but some have been not so great. But again, they're put in situations. I think these two presidents, there was not much they could have done. They were in really bad space. The country was spiraling out of control, and it's nowhere close to where we are today. But I cannot believe that, because I would not have had Lincoln as the greatest of all time. I've never felt that way. I've always felt it's Washington. Maybe it's a romantic thing, but I think Lincoln, looking at this in depth, and I've really done a little bit of legwork on this on my own and a lot of reflection. So there you are. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I hope that if you do, you join. I hope to offer more content on different historical musings and things I find interesting. So have a great day, and if you like this channel, please subscribe. Thank you.